Everybody just chill.
Play ball.
It's Mrs. Klein.
And Mr. Creighton. We are here with your podcast on the Aztecs, and we're actually going to be combining two different lessons. We'll be combining lesson 27, which is all about the background of the Aztecs, with lesson 28.
Yep, which is all about life in Tenochtitlan, which is the capital city of the Aztec Empire.
Yeah, and so just looking at lesson 27, that starts on page 383. And so there's a guiding question, and that question is, how did the Aztecs rise to power?
All right, and as always, you guys, there's some vocabulary terms. This time they are Aztecs, causeway, conformity, mercenary, plaza, and Tenochtitlan.
All right, guys, looking at the introduction on page 383. The Aztecs were a Mesoamerican people who built a vast empire for nearly 100 years in what is today central Mexico. Their empire flourished from 1428 CE until 1519 CE, when it was destroyed by invaders from Spain.
In 1325, the Aztecs took refuge on an island in Lake Texcoco, where Aztec priests saw the eagle on the cactus, just as the gods had promised them. The Aztecs set about building a city on the site, which they called Tenochtitlan, and made use of the land's abundant resources.
And guys, the Aztec, this story is really cool because it's a big part of Mexican heritage, and it's actually on the Mexican flag. So in this lesson, you will learn where the Aztecs came from and how they built their magnificent capital city. You will also discover how the Aztecs formed influential relationships with other groups and rose to power.
All right, you guys, the Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico. So the Aztec Empire arose in the Valley of Mexico, which is a fertile area nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. By the time the Aztecs arrived in the mid-1200s CE, the valley had been a center of civilization for more than 1,000 years.
All right, guys, looking at the arrival of the Aztecs. Sometime around 1250 CE, a new group of people arrived in the Valley of Mexico. This nomadic band of hunter-gatherers called themselves the Mexica. We know them today as the Aztecs.
All right, the Aztecs had a difficult time establishing themselves in the valley. The people living in the city-states thought the Aztecs were crude barbarians. But the Aztecs were fierce warriors, and the city-states were willing to employ them as mercenaries.
In 1319, stronger groups forced the Aztecs to move away from
Chapultepec.
Chapultepec, thank you.
You're welcome.
Will not be the last time. A rocky hill where they had made their home. The Aztecs fled to the south and became mercenaries for the city-state of Culhuacan.
You clearly didn't look at this page.
Did not.
All right, no worries. It was here, the Aztecs said, that they spotted an eagle perched atop a cactus with a long snake in its beak. The Aztecs took this as a sign that they should stay in this place, and they set to work building the city they called Tenochtitlan.
See, that's a word I can say, Tenochtitlan. The island turned out to be a good site for the Aztec city. The lake provided fish and water birds for food, and the island was easy to defend. Over time, the Aztecs' new home would grow into one of the great cities of the world.
All right, so you guys, the Aztecs started building Tenochtitlan in 1325. For the next 100 years, they again served as mercenaries for a powerful group called the Tepanecs. Through this alliance, the Aztecs gained land, trading connections, and wealth.
All right, guys, looking at section 2, it's Tenochtitlan, a city of wonders. As the Aztecs' power grew, their capital city of Tenochtitlan developed into one of the largest cities in the world. How did the Aztecs turn an island into such a great city? First, they reclaimed land from the lake by sinking timber into the water to serve as walls. Then, they filled the area between the timbers with mud, boulders, and reeds. In this way, they created small islands called chinapas, or floating gardens.
At the center of the city lay a large ceremonial plaza where the Aztecs gathered for religious rituals, feasts, and festivals. Inside the plaza, a stone pyramid called the Great Temple loomed 150 feet into the sky.
Just outside the plaza stood the royal palace, which was 2 stories and functioned like a small town. The city's main marketplace was located in the northern section in Tlaxcoco.
The island connects to the mainland by 3 causeways, the longest of which stretched 5 miles. The city boasted other technological marvels, like the aqueducts that carried fresh water for irrigation.
All right, now looking at the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan began simply as the Aztecs' home city, but after the Aztecs and their allies defeated the Tenapacs in 1428 CE, it became the capital of a growing empire.
All right, unlike other empire builders, the Aztecs neither established colonies nor forced conformity on their subjects. Instead, the Aztec Empire was a loose union of hundreds of city-states that had to pay tribute to the Aztecs. So tribute is like money and goods and things like that.
Yeah. Collecting tribute was the empire's most vital business because they relied on tribute to support Tenochtitlan's huge population.
Okay, all right, now we're going to find out about their fierce warrior nature. So warfare was the center of Aztec life. Successful battles allowed the Aztecs to increase their source of tribute and gain additional territory, laborers, and sacrificial victims.
The Aztecs only made a few demands of the defeated city. The people had to pay tribute, honor the god. This is a fun one. Huitlipochtli and promise obedience to the Aztec ruler. That was not close, guys. Not close at all.
Huitzilopochtli is
There
what
you
I
go.
think is how we say his name. Okay,
Much
but
better.
they got to honor the god. I don't think they would. They would not be honoring the god.
I
like
would be
that.
sacrificed.
Okay. All right. While these conditions made it easy for the Aztecs to rule, most of the conquered people never thought of themselves as true Aztecs. And eventually, you guys, the Spanish would take advantage of that weakness by making allies of the Aztecs' enemies when they invaded Mexico in 1519.
All right, guys. So, quick summary of this lesson. Reminder: we're going to still tackle the next lesson too. So, in this lesson, you learned about the rise of the Aztecs from a band of nomads to the masters of a great empire. The Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico. The Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the mid-1200s CE. For a long time, they served as mercenaries for and adopted the gods and culture of more powerful groups, such as the Teotihuacans, Toltecs, and the Tepanecs.
All right, Tenochtitlan. In 1325, the Aztecs began building their great capital, Tenochtitlan, in Lake Texcoco. They chose the location based on the sign from the gods, an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak. At its height, the impressive city boasted huge stone temples, canals, and a population greater than any European city at the time.
All right, so the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire began in 1428 when the Aztecs and their allies won a victory against the Tepanecs. The Aztecs went on to conquer most of the Valley of Mexico. Over the next nearly 100 years, the Aztecs expanded their empire through warfare and alliances. Eventually, the empire included hundreds of cities and millions of people who supported the Aztecs through vast amounts of tribute goods.
All right, you guys, now we're going to find out just a little bit more about what life was like, daily life in Tenochtitlan. This is lesson 28. There is a guiding question. What was daily life like for Aztecs living in Tenochtitlan?
All right, and then the vocab words: hereditary, polygamy, semi-divine, and ward. Looking at the introduction on page 391. The Aztecs built their large empire in central Mexico and governed it from Tenochtitlan, their capital city.
In this lesson, you will learn more about how the people of Tenochtitlan lived. You will explore Aztec class structure, marriage, family life, food, markets, religious practices, and recreation.
All right, guys, looking at class structure. Aztec society was divided into 5 main social classes. Each class had its own privileges and responsibilities. However, an Aztec status was not fixed.
All right, the Aztec ruler or emperor was considered semi-divine. The position of ruler was not hereditary, as it was in many other societies.
The next level is government officials, priests, and military leaders. The emperor was supported by a noble class of government officials, priests, and military leaders. Nobles throughout the large empire ruled cities, collected tribute, or managed the construction of public buildings and roads. Priests conducted all religious rites and served individual gods.
All right, the broad class of commoners included several smaller classes. The highest ranking commoners were professional traders called Puchteca. The Puchteca led caravans to distant lands to acquire exotic goods.
Below the Puchteca came craftspeople and artisans such as potters, jewelers, and painters. Most commoners worked as farmers, fishers, laborers, and servants. Instead of owning land, they were loaned plots of land for homes and farms by their calpulli or ward.
Okay, all right. Okay, at the bottom of Aztec society were the slaves. Prisoners of war, lawbreakers, or debtors might be forced into slavery. Aztec slaves had a number of rights, which included owning property, goods, and even other slaves.
That's different.
It is different, and I think we might have even talked about it. I know in my class I let kids know that, you know what, if you were a parent and you were in debt, oftentimes you might even sell your children into slavery. It was a temporary situation. It wasn't something that lasted forever.
Yeah, we tend to think of slavery as always lasting.
Yeah.
In this case, it wasn't like that.
Yep.
All right, guys, looking at marriage. Marriage marked an Aztec's child entry into adulthood. Marriages were arranged by the families of the bride and groom. Even among commoners, an Aztec wedding was as elaborate as the families could afford.
I think they lasted like days,
Yeah.
you guys, their wedding ceremony. So Aztecs permitted men to practice polygamy or to have multiple wives. However, when a marriage was unhappy, either spouse could ask for a divorce. So women had some rights in Aztec society.
Yeah, so that's, again, huge and very different than what we've learned about so far.
Yes.
All right, guys, family life. Men had a higher status than women in Aztec society. Within the family, the father was the master of the house. Married women could own property and sell goods.
Okay. Men built the house and worked as farmers or at a craft, while women fixed meals, tended the garden, and looked after their livestock. Many Aztec women wove beautiful cloth of many colors, and some made cloaks in patterns of sun designs or with images of shells, fish, cacti, snakes, or butterflies.
One of a woman's most important jobs was to have and care for children.
All right, yeah, you were almost like it reminds me a little bit, you guys, in sixth grade when you learned about Sparta. Like Sparta women, like their main goal was to produce more warriors. And I think it's kind of a similarity with like Aztec women wanting to do the same thing.
Yeah. So in addition to working, all boys also attended school.
All right, let's find out a little bit about Aztec food.
All right, so with the food, the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan ate both homegrown foods and foods imported from distant places. The mainstay of the Aztec diet, however, was maize, which is corn.
Yeah. To provide meat for special occasions, family might raise a few turkeys or hunt wild game such as rabbits and pigeons.
Aztec farmers also grew such crops as red peppers, tomatoes, sage, squash, green beans, sweet potatoes, and avocados.
All right, I'm hungry, surprisingly, right now, listening to that list. All right, now let's talk about their markets in Tenochtitlan. Markets were an important part of the Aztec economy. Each city in the empire had its own market, usually located in the plaza in front of the town's temple. Instead of using money, Aztecs used a barter system, trading one kind of good for another.
Guards watched over the market to make sure sellers acted honestly. The market also had a social purpose for people who went there to meet friends, gossip, and hear the news of the day.
All right. Now, the religious practices. So religious was central to Aztec life and society because the Aztecs believed that humans needed the gods for survival.
The Aztecs adopted some of their gods from other Mesoamerican groups. The Aztecs' own chief god was the same word I butchered earlier, which is
Huitzilopochtli.
Huitzilopochtli. There we go. The god of the sun and of war. So if I'm not here on Monday, it's because the god was not happy with me. In fact, the Aztecs called themselves the people of the sun.
All right, the Aztecs saw the sun as a warrior who fought each night against the forces of darkness. The way to keep the sun strong was to offer him nourishment in the form of blood.
In Tenochtitlan, up to several thousand people may have gone to sacrificial deaths each year. So again, they need the blood to nourish the gods. The Aztecs also made sacrifices to other gods. For example, honoring the fire god would include throwing sacrificial victims into a great blaze. Overall, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a much larger scale than other Mesoamerican groups.
Okay, all right. Finally, we'll learn a little bit about recreation in Tenochtitlan. One entertainment was patoli, a game played on a cross-shaped board divided into 52 squares. To move around the board, players threw beans marked with holes, or similar to dice.
Hold on, give me a second. Oya Malitzili was played on a talochli, which is a long, narrow court shaped like the letter I with high walls. This is the pocket talk game.
There we go. All right. The object, you guys, if you remember, was to get a rubber ball through the ring on the other team's side.
The Aztecs believed that the talochli court represented the world and that the ball represented a heavenly body. Because of this, the Aztecs built the talochli courts near the most important temples, like the Great Temple in Tenochtitlan.
All right. To review, you guys, we learned a little bit about daily life in the Aztecs' capital of Tenochtitlan. So as far as their class structure goes, Aztec society had 5 classes. At the top was the ruler and his family, followed by the nobles, priests, and high-ranking warriors. Next came the commoners. Below them were the peasants. And then last but not least, slaves were the lowest class, but their children were born free.
All right, marriage and family life. Aztec marriages were arranged. Men married at about 20 and women at about 16. Men had higher status, but both spouses worked to run the home, and women were honored for their ability to give birth. Men farmed and hunted while women raised the children and wove cloth. Children did chores around the house.
All right, food and markets. Maize was the main food, but the Aztecs enjoyed other local and imported foods, as well as fish and game. Markets were an important part of the Aztec economy. In daily or weekly markets, using a barter system, the Aztecs bought and sold everything from food and armor to clothing and slaves.
Religious practices. Religion was central to the Aztec society. They believed that their chief god, again, why did they do this to me? Huitzilopostli, god of the sun and war, yes, that's the third different way I've said it, I acknowledge that, needed blood for the nourishment. Because of this, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice more than other Mesoamerican groups.
All right, last but not least, recreation. The Aztecs enjoyed games, including a board game called Patoli and a ball game called Oyamalitzli.
All right, guys, so looking at the guiding question for daily life in Tenochtitlan, what was daily life like for Aztecs in Tenochtitlan? So we'll go back to the original one too.
Yeah. Whoops,
Too far.
A little bit too far with the Maya. And we've got, our question was, how did the Aztecs rise to power? So we need to be making sure that we're able to answer that guiding question as well.
All right, guys, you're out.
Stay golden.